Mr. Chairman, I'd like to commend Senator Blumenthal and Senator Blackburn for your hard work on this bill. I think this is a good bill. I think it is addressing a real problem, and I hope to be able to support the bill because I think it makes meaningful progress addressing an abuse of power of monopolists in the big tech world. I have several different amendments here that are all offered in the spirit of trying to improve the bill and trying to focus its efficacy where we have real bad conduct. I want to start by calling up my amendment SIL 22293. This is an amendment that focuses on the definitions in the bill. And I emphatically agree with the authors of this bill that when it comes to app stores, there are two massive monopolists, Apple and Google, that dominate the app space. They dominate the app space, and their practices, as the subcommittee hearing demonstrated, are abusive to small players. The philosophy I believe that we should take approaching the abuse of power by big tech is to focus on the giant monopolists and limit their power, but at the same time maintain a free and vibrant competitive environment for smaller players, for players, new entrants in the field, for people that are not the giant monopolists but are the David seeking to slay the Goliath. That if we want to see the best cure for abuse of power is competition, and so I have concerns the current bill is drafted, the definitions are too broad. So for example, as the definition is drafted about app and app stores, one company that could be swept into it right now is Mozilla. Mozilla owns the Firefox browser. That has about 3.6% of all browser market share. It's not a big player. We want an environment where there's small competitors that are challenging the major incumbents. Likewise, Brave. Brave is an emergency tech company that offers open source, privacy-focused web browsers, and Brave is popular because it's transparent, unlike Google. Brave also is another company that potentially could be pulled into this. A third company that we have heard from is we've heard from a company, Valve, which is a smaller video game developer that operates a distribution system for PC platforms. As the current definition is drafted, a browser whereby you could access a web page arguably is covered by this bill. I don't think that's the intent of the drafters. I don't think these are the companies that the drafters are trying to get to. And so what my amendment does is it narrows the field and it puts in, it actually follows the model of the bill this committee passed 2 weeks ago, where we focused on the big major players, and so it puts in a substantial market cap requirement and a substantial requirement in terms of individual and unique users so that we are going after the bad actors in the field and we're not stifling competition from potential new entrants. And I think by focusing on the monopolists today and also any subsequent monopolists tomorrow who might rise to that dominant position, I think that focuses this bill where we really see the conduct that needs to be addressed. And so I would urge adoption of this amendment.
Any discussion on the amendment offered by Senator Cruz? Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I appreciate Senator Cruz's thoughtfulness in the 4 amendments that he has brought forward to us to look at. And of course, as you look at the definitions system, definitions portion of this bill, I think it's important to note we have worked with these developers. We've worked with Valve. They had no problem with how the definitions are. We've worked with the Coalition of App Developers, the Coalition for App Fairness, and have made certain that what we were doing is something that would help to solve the problems in the marketplace. But I appreciate his recognition and posing the question of what if for different developers. I do commit to working as we move toward the Senate floor, and on the amendment today, I would urge a no vote.
Further discussion on the amendment? Senator Blumenthal?
Thanks, Chairman Durbin. I second my colleague, Senator Blackburn's remarks. I'm sympathetic to some of the goals here, and I would continue to work with you, Senator Cruz, with Valve and other companies. We've heard from them, and we want to respond to any legitimate criticisms and sharpen the definitions, as you've suggested, if necessary. And I would just urge a no vote on this amendment.
Can I ask a question of the bill sponsors? Is it your intention to focus this bill on the big major monopolists, or is it your intention to sweep in smaller players like a Mozilla, like a Brave, smaller players that are no stretch of the imagination monopolists? Because if it's the former, I'm enthusiastically on board. If it's the latter, I have very serious concerns.
In my view, the former.
Well, I will take the representations from the bill authors at face value, and I appreciate your willingness to work with me. And with that representation, I'll withdraw this amendment at this time and not call for a vote. But I look forward to working with your staff to ensure that we're targeting the big guys and not the small entrants. That it becomes, we want a scenario where the next innovator can topple the monopolist, and if we inadvertently put barriers to entry or make it harder for a new revenue model to topple whoever the existing monopolist is, that's going backwards. And so with that commitment to work together, I will withdraw this amendment from consideration at this time.
Amendment 22293 is withdrawn. Senator Kennedy?
I wanted to ask Senator Blumenthal, I appreciate your comments, but tell me specifically why you think Ted's definition is too narrow, or Senator Cruz's definition is too narrow?
If you look at the amendment, Senator Kennedy, it has a number of thresholds
Right,
for applying.
right.
I want to look at those thresholds more thoroughly and carefully to determine whether they serve the purpose that we share, which is to go after the gatekeepers. And for example, just speaking for myself, not for any other co-sponsors, I would be loath to include a company like Valve at its number of users in this legislation. But I want to work with Senator Blackburn to know her views and other co-sponsors before we make decisions about what the threshold numbers should be. But as I've said to Senator Cruz, our target here are the gatekeepers that are throttling innovation and preventing rivals and startups from coming to market, imposing a rent or fee, a VIG, as I've termed it, up to 30%, which increase costs to consumers. I think we share common goals here. Senator Cruz and his staff have been responsive to us, and I want to continue that work.
So you just need some time to talk it through?
Correct.
Okay. Would you include me in those discussions?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Are there any further amendments to come? Senator Cruz?
Mr. Chairman, next I'd like to call up Amendment SIL 22251. And this addresses an issue that Senator Lee raised earlier in this hearing. One of the most disturbing trends we've seen in modern digital age is the throttling by giant tech companies of thoughts or opinions or beliefs that are not fashionable, that they don't agree with. Every American has a right to be heard. Every American has a right to live according to their faith, to make the case to their fellow citizens. You don't have to be persuaded, but we all have a right to argue for what we believe in, whether it is political views or whether it is our religious faith. None of these fundamental rights protected in the First Amendment should cost a person their ability to live and flourish in the modern digital age. This amendment would simply ensure that app stores that are monopolists would not be able to discriminate against apps based upon the political or religious viewpoints of the developer of the app or the app's users. It requires neutrality so that they are true public fora. And this is not a hypothetical. We've seen examples of some of the biggest app stores working together to take an app off their platform because they did not like the speech that was being said there. Specifically, Parler. Parler was created as an alternative to some of the big social media companies because people who were conservative, people who were libertarian were getting censored on the big social media sites, and they wanted another place to speak. And we saw in conduct that was brazenly anti-competitive, that was brazenly, I think, contrary to existing antitrust laws, Apple, Google, and Amazon all simultaneously took Parler off their platforms and said, you're not allowed to speak, your users are not allowed to speak because we don't like the content of what you're saying. It's since become clear that similar speech was happening at the time on Facebook, on Twitter, on Reddit, and yet they were not subject to that consequence. Parler was. What happened to Parler was wrong. What happened to its users were wrong. And I recognize on this committee there are members of this committee whose political views differ. Multiple members of this committee used Parler, engaged in Parler as a tool to communicate with our constituents. Even if you disagree with the politics of a particular speaker, whether it is on Facebook, on Twitter, or Parler, or somewhere else, members of this committee ought to be committed to the principle of free speech, that our constituents have a right to speak and persuade each other, and that we should not be enabling modern-day oligarchs to discriminate against the free speech rights of Americans or to discriminate against religious faith. And so this amendment provides simply a neutral standard that you cannot discriminate against an app if you're a monopolist based on either political views or religious faith. And I would urge adoption of the amendment.
I might just comment. This is tricky territory, and we know it. I don't believe incitement to violence is protected political speech, nor do I believe anti-Semitic hate speech is protected political speech. That's my interpretation, and I think if we are opening those possibilities, we're in for a much different debate. Does anyone else seek recognition? Senator Blumenthal.
Since we're approaching the 11 o'clock hour, if we haven't passed it already, I will respond very briefly. This bill is not about political speech. It's not about discrimination. It's really about protecting consumers. I am concerned about the way this amendment is written, applying to non-discrimination against, quote, political or religious speech or viewpoints, which provides a vast, broad reason that the potential anti-competitive practice could be justified by Apple or Google tying up action in the courts for years and years. And so I'm going to urge defeat of this amendment.
Mr. Chairman, a quick clarification. Senator Blumenthal just suggested that this amendment would somehow provide a safe harbor for anti-competitive conduct. To the contrary, this amendment puts an additional restriction on the monopolist. So it's not a defense for the monopolists. It is an additional restriction that you cannot be discriminating against apps or users based on their political views or religious faith. So it is exactly the opposite of a safe harbor. It is an additional restriction.
Questions on the adoption of Amendment 22251. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Leahy? No. Mrs. Feinstein? Mr. Whitehouse? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. Cruz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Blumenthal?
No.
Mr. Rono? No. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Padilla? No. Mr. Ossoff? No. Mr. Grassley?
Aye.
Mr. Graham?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Corning?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cruz?
Aye.
Mr. Sacks?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Hawley?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Cotton?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Kennedy?
Aye.
Mr. Tillis?
Aye by proxy.
Mrs. Blackburn? No. Mr. Chair Durbin?
No.
Chair Durbin, the votes are 10 yeas, 12 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Any further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.